Hallelujah. Well, you're ready by now for a test on all we studied in Daniel 11, aren't you? Well, it's not April, but I'm just kidding. Hallelujah. That'd probably be pretty difficult. Probably more than Hebrew. Hallelujah. Topic tonight, the Abomination of Desolation. Semi-topic, let's be honest now. Let's don't excite someone unnecessarily. Well, we're going to get into a verse. What verse is it? Verse 31? Yes, verse 31. We're going to get into a verse. That ought to be the end verse of what we're going to look at tonight, Daniel 11, where the phrase is mentioned one of 4 times in Daniel where it occurs. So we'll do a little study of that and trace it somewhat over into the New Testament. But it'll, well, I don't know how brief it'll be. We'll have to wait and see. But it is our topic as far as it applies here in Daniel 11, but not necessarily all the other ramifications of it. So, finally you're going to see what all of these verses in Daniel 11 have been about, particularly just to lead us up to verses 31 through 35, why we have all of these verses, which we've intimated before. However, I think last time we stopped with the 28th verse, so we'll have to go back and briefly read over those verses. 25 to 28 was the context for the message last time. And then, hopefully, Lord willing, tonight we'll be looking at verses 29 through 31. And remember, in the intertestamental period class, we're only going to be going through verse 35. So we'll be down to having just 4 verses, 32 through 35, by the time we get through tonight. But there still is a lot of very interesting material back in the books of Maccabees that fit appropriately enough in parallel places here in Daniel 11. And the vast majority of it, you see, will fit, let's say, in verses 30 through 35. I would say the vast majority, the larger section down in verses 32 through 35. So we're going to only be touching on those parts of Maccabees that would be parallel to verses 30 and 31, because chiefly that would be in verses 32 through 35 that we're going to see the books come into play and that we're going to need to read a little bit in them. Remember from last week how intricate you have to be in paralleling the two. And really the books of Maccabees are not going to be that meaningful to someone until you know where they fit into the book of Daniel. And vice versa, Daniel 11. It's explained so much over in the books of Maccabees. Let's read verses 25 through 28 to get the context of speaking about Epiphanes again. Then he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. That means the latter had a larger army than the king of the north, Epiphanes, but he didn't win, because he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. So here we have, technically speaking, our first invasion of Egypt under Epiphanes in 170 A.D., where the king of the south, Ptolemy VI, and then Ptolemy VII, lost in the battle of Pelusium, just a city a little bit east of the Nile River Delta, year 170 A.D. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both these kings, Antiochus, Epiphanes, and Ptolemy VI, their heart shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. But it shall not prosper, because it's not the Lord's will yet for the king of the south to be totally subdued by the king of the north. And so the Lord has the brother of Ptolemy VI, which would be Ptolemy VII, rise up. He's appointed king in Alexandria by the people, and he marries his sister Cleopatra II. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed, the end of the kingdom, when God desires that there be an end to the kingdom of the south. Then shall he return unto his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And I think we briefly looked at that in 1 Maccabees 1, where he does fight against Egypt. He is victorious. Many do fall down slain. He does carry back great riches and spoil and treasures with him. And moreover, he stops by in Palestine to wreak havoc in a small degree by stealing a lot of the things out of the sanctuary of the Lord. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Now, verses 29 through 31 are going to give us our second invasion of Egypt by Antiochus Epiphanes. The second invasion of Egypt. 2 years later, 168 BC. And you can put down in your notes, just jot it down only for now, and we'll look at it, I see later on tonight. 1 Maccabees 1:29, 2 Maccabees 5:1. And we'll turn to those passages later. But just remember that the context of what we're going to be speaking of here will be the second invasion of Egypt by Epiphanes. By the way, these verses 29 through 31, we haven't even got to read them yet, but you're going to see that they're very, very similar when you compare them with verses 25 through 28. By that I mean that the king of the north goes into Egypt, invades it, attempts to take the country. We've got various battles. They're separated by 2 years. And in one sense, he's not successful in the first attempt. In the second attempt, he's not successful at all. But remember, in the first attempt, the angel says that the king of the south will not stand, and Ptolemy VI was defeated. But that doesn't mean Epiphanes got the country, because his brother, the seventh, comes on the throne in Alexandria. Nevertheless, whenever, getting back to what I was saying, when he goes back home, Epiphanes, he'll go back through Palestine, just like he did the first time. We're going to have more problems, and the problems this time are of a much more serious nature than they were the first time. So the verses read very, very similar. The king of the north goes into battle in Egypt, and he, let's just say for all practical purposes, in the final analysis of things, he's not successful. And then on the way home, he goes through Palestine, causes great problems as far as the Jews are concerned and as far as their temple, their sanctuary is concerned. So let that be known, and with that in mind, then let's get into verses 29 through 31. At the time appointed, we happen to know 2 years later, both from the secular historians as well as the books of Maccabees. Then shall he return into his land. Well, I'm reading the earlier verse. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. He'll return. He's going to do it again. Second invasion. Come toward the south. We already know what the south means. We've proven that in Daniel 11. That's the country of Egypt. And now we have a strange translation in the KJV. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Now that reading would imply we're talking about what? Well, a middle battle. That if you've got a former and a latter, but yet you're talking about neither one of those, you have to be in between the two to talk about the former and the latter. So we must be talking about a middle battle here. But we don't know of that, though. All we know is a first, technically speaking, major invasion of Egypt, 170, and a second major invasion of Egypt, 168. We don't know about another one. So you can have first and latter. You can have the former and the latter, but you can't have something in between. Therefore, the way it's been translated would really be incorrect. The word order should be rearranged a little bit, and we'll come out with the right meaning, leaving essentially the same words, but subtracting the word it and or as. So it should read, but the latter shall not be as the former. You just have to kind of rearrange the sentence a little. But the latter shall not be as the former. So you can practice surgery on your Bible or put it into your notes, one or the other. Or both, sooner or later anyway. But the latter shall not be as the former. He's talking about the latter trip into Egypt right now. That's what the verse is about, the latter trip. And it will not be as the former. That's verses 25 to 28. But yet if you've got an it still to account for, you've got a former, a latter, and then an it, well, then we're in trouble. So it's just, the translation is not so bad. It's just the word order in the translation is bad. But the latter shall not be as the former. Okay, that tells us then that he's going to be not successful, as he was only semi-successful back in verse 25. We read that the king of the south shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. But as I've already shown you, it didn't really mean that he was that successful, because nothing, no part, no realm of Egypt went into the hands of the king of the north. So although he took back a spoil, he took back treasures, he still was his own king in his own kingdom, and the king of the south was that in his. But he had a measure of success just in taking all the spoil and in winning the battle of Pelusium. Now we're going to have no battle. There's not going to be a battle. So if there's not going to be a battle, there's no way the latter can be like the former, because there's no way he can win, even in the partial sense of the word. And I'll explain that more as we go along. For the ships of Kittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. We've seen that now several times. And it just comes more and more into play in this section, verses 30 through 35. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So let's deal with the aspects, first of all, in these verses, of the relation between the king of the north and the king of the south, and then between the king of the north and the people of Israel. So we're told in verse 29 that the king of the north will not be, this latter invasion of Egypt will not be as the former. That means it will not be successful. Why? Why will it not be successful? Well, the first part of the next verse answers that question for us. The first part of verse 30. The latter shall not be as the former, because we read that the ships of Kittim, K-I-T-T-I-M, will come against him. Let's jump all the way back to Genesis chapter 10. Who are the ships of Kittim? Well, I know they're boats, but I mean the people in them. Who are the ships of Kittim? Anyone know or remember? Jump all the way back to Genesis 10. This takes us back to the creation series, creation tape number 64. Here we go, cross-referencing for you again. The more material you get, the more cross-referencing you have to have. Amen. And it's at the end of that tape, I believe, the end of tape CR 64, where we discuss one of these names in this long, what's it called here in Genesis 10? Table of Nations. Table of Nations. This long table of nations. Remember that time I think we did about 4 messages on all the on the Hivites and the termites and all the ites here in this chapter. We did a lot of looking at that. A couple of them we skipped over. I wonder why, like Gomer and Magog and things like that, but some of them we didn't, like in chapter 10 verse 4. Now we're talking about Japhethites here. We have it divided up here, the Japhethites, the Hamites, and the Shemites, or the Semites. The sons of Javan, Elisha. And now who's, well, you might not remember all these names, but you remember who Javan was? We've discussed that already earlier here in Daniel 11, verse 2. Daniel 11. Last word. I'm really giving it away. Daniel 11:2. Greece, yes. You look in your Hebrew Bible, as we did when we studied that verse. You look in your Hebrew Bible, and it's not Greece, it's Javan. The sons of Javan. So this would be the founding father. Remember, there's a little difficulty knowing whether we're talking about a personality, an individual person here, or someone who represents the nation that came after him, or a group of people, or the nation, or the territory. That's a little bit difficult to know, but we know we're talking something about the country of Greece, or at least the people that founded Greece, and then the country would have to come afterwards. The sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. Kittim. There's the first time where it occurs, Kittim. I don't have all the places down, but it occurs, I think, over in Isaiah and Jeremiah some, where it has one particular meaning, and then it occurs in two unusual places. One's in Daniel 11:30, and the other is in Numbers chapter 24. So let's go over and look at the Numbers passage. Numbers chapter 24. Anyone remember yet who that refers to? Let me start off by telling you historically the way it progressed. Immediately, in the first place, it referred to the eastern shore of the island of Cyprus. The eastern shore of the island of Cyprus. I don't, again, have time to go through my list up here and find my maps, but let's say we've got Palestine right here, and this is the big Mediterranean Sea, shaped this way. Here's Palestine. Here's Cyprus right here, the eastern shore. Remember, this is written and this is understood from the point of view of the Hebrews who live in Palestine. And so when they start talking about the isles of the sea, they're talking about what they know to exist somewhere out here in the Mediterranean. When they're talking about Kittim, the original meaning, evidently back in the very beginning, whenever the word was first used or coined, referred to the eastern shore of Cyprus. Why the eastern shore? That's the closest shore to Palestine. Then secondly, it came to refer to the whole island. Then thirdly, you just have to trace this through history. It came to refer to neighboring islands, other islands that were near the island of Cyprus. And fourthly and finally, it came to refer to many things in the western part of the Mediterranean Sea. And part of that fourth progression of and development of meaning would be something very, very specific that I'll give you here in a minute that relates to Daniel 11. Numbers 24, verses 15 through 25. This is a very, very interesting and unique prophecy of Balaam. He's given, so far, all the prophecies that are recorded in Scripture are true prophecies, although he's called, in I believe 2 Peter 2, a false prophet, one who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Is a false prophet, but he gave true prophecy. If you have problems with that, remember it was Caiaphas that prophesied the death of Christ. He said it's expedient that one man die for this nation and not for the whole nation. Well, he's an apostate high priest. He's the one who acquiesces in the crucifixion of Christ. Yet his prophecy was true. We learn from Balaam's account that God can take the tongue of an ass and make it speak whatever he desires for it to speak. So certainly he can take the tongue of a false prophet and make it give true prophecy. And Numbers 22, 23, and 24 are filled with true prophecies. And probably the most far-reaching and the most unique of all of them would be in this last part of his ministry, verses 15 through 25. Or that's recorded as far as his prophecies go. He has ministry later on. He seduces some of the Israelites to lay with the women of Midian. So he ends up showing himself for who he really is. Verse 15, Numbers 24. He took up this parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said, he hath said, which heard the words of God, knew the knowledge of the Most High, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. That sounds like a messianic prophecy there. And shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Israel shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth of the city. And when he looked on Amalek, he took up his parable and said, Amalek was the first of the nations. That is, the first to fight against Israel. She destroyed the stragglers, remember, whenever they came out of Egypt. But his latter end shall be that he perish forever. Then he looked upon the Kenites, some people who had followed Israel, and took up his parable and said, Strong is thy dwelling place. Now puttest thou thy nest in a rock. Nevertheless, the Kenites shall be wasted until Ashur shall carry thee away captive. He took up his parable and said, Alas, who shall live when God doeth this? And ships shall come from the coast of Kittim. It's Kittim again, and ships again. So we know it has to be a Mediterranean power. There's no doubt about that. It's not Babylon. It's not Media. It's not Persia. It's not Assyria. It's not the Scythians. Can't be any people like that, because you couldn't speak of them coming in their ships. They would come across the land. And ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, and shall afflict Asher, and shall afflict Eber, and he also shall perish forever. And Balaam rose up and went and returned to his place, and Balak went his way. Well, that's, in some sense of the word, I guess because of the terminology used. The ships shall come from the coast of Kittim is related to Daniel 11 and verse 30. Now, there's a lot that's mysterious there in Numbers 24. That's one of those Old Testament passages, but just a lot of material there. It's very difficult to understand. It's not like we have all the Old Testament now all, sealed up, and we're satisfied because we have total knowledge of everything back there. It's very, very mysterious in many regards. But anyway, flipping back over to Daniel 11 and verse 30, Kittim seems to later have been taken as a name for the Romans. In Livy's writing, Livy 45 and verse 10, he interprets this, Kittim, as being a reference to Rome. Now, he wasn't a Bible commentator, but Kittim, for him, referred to Rome. The LXX actually translates the sense of the passage by inserting Rome. Although Rome, as far as any letters are concerned, is not found here in Daniel 11. It's not found in Daniel 11:30. Kittim is found there. The LXX translators took maybe a little bit of liberty, but at least it was correct liberty. And it wasn't just liberty to put in whatever they imagined, but they put in what they felt was the sense of this ships of Kittim. That would be the ships of Rome. I wouldn't recommend that one marks out Kittim, because that's what the Hebrew has. But what's the sense? If you don't know what the literal word means, then you have to know something about the sense. And so the sense should be interpreted as a reference to Rome. For the ships of Rome shall come against him. We were asking the question, why was Epiphanes not successful? And it's answered for us here in the first part of this verse, because the ships of Rome shall come against him. So let me give you a little history of what takes place here in the second invasion of Egypt before we move on beyond that. Epiphanes goes down, and the Romans hear about it. Now, the Romans are all over that part of the world, so although they don't have telephones and telegraphs, it's not a big deal to have news all the way back to the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate sends out its ships to meet Epiphanes just outside of the city of Alexandria. The Roman leader, the man who's in charge at this time, is one Popilius Lenus, L-A-E-N-A-S, Popilius Lenus, L-A-E-N-A-S, who steps off the boat, comes just outside the city of Alexandria, just at the time that Epiphanes, by marching with his army, has gotten that far, and hands him a letter written from the Roman Senate forbidding him to make war against Egypt. Now, Rome's interfered a little bit on an earlier occasion, back with his father, Antiochus the Great, back in verses 17 through 19. Remember, Rome interfered back there, said don't play around with Egypt anymore. But she has yet to exert complete dominance over this part of the Mediterranean world. As a matter of fact, it's not until what? I think your chart will say about 63. It's not until 63 that Pompey actually invades and takes over and therefore controls the land of Palestine. So it's a little while past this. We're way back 168 BC. We're talking about over 100 years later before Rome actually exerts her power enough so that in the year 63 BC, Pompey actually invades and controls Jerusalem and Palestine. So Popilius Lenus hands the letter forbidding, from the Roman Senate, forbidding Epiphanes to make war. Epiphanes pauses in giving a reply. He spent all this money, all this time, all of this exertion to bring this whole army from Syria all the way down here, and now someone hands him a letter and says that's a no-no. Now, it's not easy to just say, okay, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm going to go back home then. Because you wasted all that time and all these supplies and all the finances, the money involved in that. So he hesitates. And this is written in many sources of ancient history. And so Popilius Linus takes out his sword and draws a circle all the way around Epiphanes. Wonder where we get this little idea of drawing lines? Draws a circle. See, if you know history, you know what's going on in the world today. History just repeats itself time and time and time again. Amen. Drew a line around him. Said, I forbid you to step outside that circle until you make up your mind and let me know what you're going to do. So he stood there for a while. I mean, he's got a whole army with him. The Romans sent a few ships. They could have defeated those men in those few ships. He sat there and thought for a while, and Epiphanes had been a captive in Rome for 12 years, remember. And I said a long time ago that was going to help him later on in his life. It helps him, well, positively and negatively here. Positively, it saves his life. Negatively, he doesn't get to attack Egypt because from his years in Rome, he was smart enough to know I better not do what the Roman Senate said don't do. You might be able to overcome these couple of ships here, but they'll send out the whole Roman army, the whole Roman force against you, and he wouldn't stand a chance against that. So there's the origin of drawing lines in the dust and daring someone to step over. Although today it's done in a little different sense. Drew a circle around him and said, don't step. It wasn't a dare. He just said, don't step out until your mind is made up. One way or the other, whichever you're going to do. Popilius Linus knows he can't conquer Epiphanes right there on the scene, but he wants to know his reply. So he thinks about it for a few more minutes and says, I think I'll go home. So his 12 years spent in captivity in Rome, and he wasn't really captive. As a matter of fact, Popilius Linus and him were friends whenever they were in Rome. He knew a lot of the people higher up. He wasn't, stuck away in a dungeon somewhere. People sometimes think that was true of Paul. He was in prison in Rome. He wasn't in prison. Acts 28 says he was under house arrest, and house arrest is a lot different than being in a dungeon or being in a prison somewhere. Paul wasn't in prison there, and he wasn't really in prison in Caesarea. He was under house arrest for 2 years in Caesarea, and he was under house arrest in Rome for several years before he was released, before he was captured again, retried, convicted, and executed in around 67 A.D. But that's getting into church history and not intertestamental period history. So his entire army has wasted this trip. Consequently, we're trying to build all this up so you'll see the consequences and the logical order of this in your mind. Consequently, what do you think he's going to do when he goes back through Palestine this time? He did it the first time. I mean, if he had gone in and just wiped Egypt off, well, he'd probably let Palestine go. Who cares about Palestine? Palestine is nothing. Palestine's just a bargaining chip as far as they're concerned. It happens to belong to the king of the north at this time. Ever since 198, it happens to belong to the king of the north. The king of the south had controlled it from 320 B.C. to 198. So it's not that he's got to subdue Palestine to gain that as his territory. It already belongs to him. But when you don't get to take Egypt like you had desired and like you'd planned, and now you've made 2 unsuccessful expeditions against Egypt, then you're going to vent one's anger on Palestine or on whatever country is on your way home. That's why it's been so significant that the 2 countries fighting are Syria and Egypt. And the only one country in between those 2, of course, is Israel. So with that in mind, let's go on and look at the conclusion then. The ships of Kittim shall come out against him. Therefore he shall be grieved. Well, he certainly was. See, it paints the picture very well. How did Daniel know? Well, you see, Daniel didn't know. That's why the critics have such a big problem. How did Daniel know that some man was going to get his sword out and draw it around him, make him go home, and he's going to pout like an overgrown child? Well, Daniel doesn't know that. But God does, and God tells his angel, and his angel tells Daniel. And Daniel tells the other Jews by writing it down. And because it's been written down and kept in the canon of the Jews, and we know about it today.
Praise God.
He will be grieved and return home, just like he returned home in verse 28. He'll return to his own land in verse 28. Return to his own land twice in verse 28. He will return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. Well, look what we saw in verse 28. His heart shall be against the holy covenant. Happened twice, because he, technically speaking, was defeated twice. So shall he do. That's just repeating what he just said. He'll have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. An arm shall stand up on his part, and shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Okay, let's jot down a few other things before we get into looking at some of these passages in Maccabees. 2 Maccabees chapter 5 and verse 15. You'll note that, and we'll eventually look at all of this, but I want to look at it in a certain order. And then let's turn to 1 Maccabees 1. Look at a few verses here, and then we're going to end up looking at this whole section, because we want to fit this in for you. If you don't have time to read it all at home, we can read a lot of it here and fit it in for you, so you'll have it down in your notes how and where it fits. Let's see, one other thing I want to say before going over there. I divided tonight's study, hopefully we're going to divide it, between verses 31 and 32. It's because part of verse 32 is a recapitulation of what was seen earlier in verse 30, and it's setting up two classes of people in Israel. We can kind of tell from verses 30 and 31 that two classes exist, but verse 32 really divides it. The first part of the verse speaks of those who do wickedly against the covenant, and then the second part speaks of those who will be strong through the Lord. Well, the first part of that verse, first part of verse 32, is already seen in the last part of verse 30. He's going to give it in verse 30, and then he's going to return to that train of thought here in a moment. But it's a certain group of people. Have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So, in light of that, let's look at 1 Maccabees 1, verses 42 and 43, and then verses 51 and 52. And remember, we're looking at this in light of the last part of verse 30. He will have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. The king then issued a decree throughout his empire, and his subjects were all to become one people and abandon their laws and their religion. Now this is Epiphanes, he's the king, and it's not directed just against Israel, but against everyone. Everyone that's part of his empire will adopt his religion and abandon their own. And nations everywhere complied with the royal command, and look at this, many in Israel accepted the foreign worship, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. Now that verse, 1 Maccabees 1:43, parallels directly with Daniel 11:30, the end of the verse, and Daniel 11:32, the first part of the verse. And then verse 51. Such was the decree when the king issued to all his subjects. He appointed superintendents over all the people, and instructed the towns of Judea to offer sacrifice town by town. And people thronged to their side in large numbers, every one of them a traitor to the law. Every one of them a traitor to the law. Now, before going on, turn back earlier in this chapter to verses 11 through 15. We've already seen this happen once earlier, but this was at an earlier time. This was way back at the very beginning. Remember, whenever we have a change in the high priesthood, in 174, Onias III is disposed of in favor of his younger brother. And because of that, whenever Jason comes in, then you've got verse 11. At that time, there appeared in Israel a group of renegade Jews. Said, let us enter into a covenant with the Gentiles round about us, and so forth. So they've already, some Jews have apostatized from the faith earlier. And then in between these two accounts we've just read, you've got Well, his first invasion of Egypt down there in verse 16. And 17, it says with a great fleet that cavalry and a great fleet, he invaded Egypt. That's his first invasion there. And then we're going to have another invasion. If you look at verse 29, speaks of 2 years later. 2 years later from what? From 170, which gives you the date we're looking at tonight, 168. See, Maccabees, first Maccabees, much of it is historically reliable. It's right on cue. And then it goes on to speak about those who have rebelled against the law. So back to Daniel 11:30. He will have indignation against the holy covenant. We're going to read those verses, most of them, maybe all of them here in a moment, where we see him venting this indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Therefore, 1 Maccabees 1:43 and 1 Maccabees 1:52 would refer to this group of people, apostates in Israel, Hellenists in Israel, who are willing to give up the traditions and the laws of Moses in favor of the Greek way of life. And evidently, Antiochus, through his various ambassadors and so forth, is able to reach some of the leaders of these people. And that's why it says he will have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. A network of intrigue starts up between Epiphanes and some of these leading apostate Hellenistic Jews, so that he can make an attempt to subdue the entire nation. Then that leaves us just tonight with verse 31 to discuss. Arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. Number 1, they shall take away the daily sacrifice. Number 2, they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Number 3. This verse is the major verse here in this section. One of the most important verses of all the verses at which we've looked thus far. Well, let's take that back. It's the most important one we've looked at thus far. But verses 32 through 35 would be on the same level as this 31st verse. So if you want to know what's most important from Daniel 11, 1 through 35, not counting the end of the chapter that talks about Antichrist, but 1 through 35, it would be verses 31 through 35 are definitely the most important. That's why I said this is what all of the chapter has been leading up to. So the most important verse we've looked at thus far would be this 31st verse. 3 things are mentioned here: the pollution of the sanctuary, the cessation of daily sacrifice, and the setting up of the AD, the Abomination of Desolations. Okay, let's look at that. This is paralleled in Daniel 8, verses 23 through 25. The same events taking place in Daniel 11:31 are intimated precisely in Daniel 8, 23 through 25. This section also is talking about Epiphanes. Verse 21 speaks of the rough goat. That's the king of Greece. That's Alexander. The great horn is this king. Verse 22, when it's broken, 4 other leaders will stand up. His kingdom was divided. Verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom. The latter time. We're talking about the Greek kingdom that comes into being with Alexander around 336. Alexander lives 336 to 323 BC. That the Greek kingdom comes into play there. Now, it's going to pass off the scene very, very shortly. As a matter of fact, in a true sense of the word, this year, 168 BC, can be the year that the kingdom is dated as passing off the scene. So if we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, and we're talking about the latter time of their kingdom, how much more latter could you get than the final year of the Greek Empire, 168? Now, I'll show you why I say that here in a moment. The latter time of their kingdom. So that latter time phrase there is important. But it's not like other latter times in Scripture where we know he's talking about, the end of time when Jesus is coming back. This is just the latter time of the Greek kingdom, where the transgressors are come to the full. Well, we've seen many of those in Israel, transgressors in Israel. We just read about them there in 1 Maccabees, and we see them here in Daniel. That a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Epiphanes, who is a type of Antichrist. As a matter of fact, what is said here in these verses apply definitely to Antichrist. Some of it applies more to Epiphanes than to Antichrist, specifically in the beginning part of this section, verses 23 through 25. Then as you work your way to the end, it applies more to Antichrist than it does to Epiphanes. Thus we have this so-called bleeding over between the two. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Well, God gives him the power. God gives Epiphanes the power. And then if you want to interpret that as a reference to Antichrist, well, we're told over in Revelation 13 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that he gets his power from the devil. Antichrist has no power. He's just a man. He gets his power as he's inspired by Satan. So his power shall be mighty, but it won't be his own power. He will destroy wonderfully, will prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. That's the nation of Israel. It's fulfilled in the times of the Maccabees. Shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. Remember, we looked at this earlier. Remember, it refers to his subtlety and his flattery. And he shall stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Well, in a more complete sense, could we think of Antichrist and not Epiphanes standing up against the prince of princes, as we know Antichrist will do in the latter days. So we're just saying that section there parallels what we're studying in Daniel 11 and verse 31. Now back to our books of Maccabees, and let's look at these three things that Daniel has discussed. The pollution of the sanctuary, and the cessation of the daily sacrifice, and the establishment of the AD. Now these things, although they're separate, of course all of them are related. And notice all of them have to do with the liturgy of the temple service. That's what must be most important here. All of them have to do with the liturgy of the temple service.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the table.
All of them have to do with the liturgy of the temple service. That's what must be most important here. All of them have to do with the liturgy of the temple service. The temple, called here the sanctuary, I believe called here the sanctuary of strength, will be polluted. Daily sacrifice is stopped. The morning and the evening sacrifice, that's referred to in Scripture as the daily sacrifice, twice a day in the morning and the evening, that will stop. And that has to do with the temple. And the abomination that maketh desolate will be set up. Now it doesn't say here that it will be set up in the temple or in any way that it relates to the temple, but we know from two other considerations that it does relate to the temple. Number one, because the first two of these three things relates to the temple. Pollution of the sanctuary, the cessation of daily sacrifice. If those two have to do with the temple, then why not the abomination that maketh desolate? And secondly, and more reliably, you can argue on that basis, but not conclusively. More reliably, other portions of the Word of God show us that the abomination that maketh desolate did have something to do with the temple service. Okay, 1 Maccabees chapter 1 and verse 47 would parallel the pollution of the sanctuary. He says all of this is going to happen, the pollution of the sanctuary. Altars, idols, and sacred precincts were to be established. That is, pagan ones, false ones, ones that were not Jewish, ones that were in contradiction to Mosaic legislation. Swine and other unclean beasts to be offered in sacrifice. Pollution of the realm in the area of the sanctuary. Then the cessation of daily sacrifice. That's the same chapter, verse 45. burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the temple were forbidden. 1 Maccabees 1:45. That's the cessation of daily sacrifice. This was critically important for Israel during this period of time. That her holy temple now is polluted, and that she no longer can offer sacrifice to God, and finally that this abomination that maketh desolate is set up, and that's 1 Maccabees 1 and verse 54. 1 Maccabees 1:54, on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, which corresponds to our 168, that's 145 of the Seleucid Greek era, 168, the abomination of desolation was set up on the altar. The abomination of desolation was set up on the altar. Happens to inform us here that it does relate to the temple because it mentions the altar here. This begins one of the, if not the most, horrible times in Israel's history since she became a nation to this day, including the Holocaust of the Second World War. There's no doubt about the fact that Israel has never, as a nation, experienced a time like the 3-year period from 168 to 165, the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes. If Epiphanes was to be a type of Antichrist, and he was, then what would those 3 years of persecution be a type of? The tribulation as far as Israel is concerned. A type of, which is only a shadow, only a portent of what Israel is going to experience in the tribulation period. That she will experience at the hands of Antichrist, just prior to the second advent of Christ. Now, to paint that picture better for you, let's read some now in Maccabees. Let's read 1 Maccabees 1, 29 through 59. So let it be known then, we're trying to show you all these parallels again. 1 Maccabees 1, 29 through 59 parallels these verses that we're studying, specifically Daniel 11 verses 30 and 31. You see verse 32, whenever Israel revolts and resists the inroads of Hellenism and the king of the north, that will be told for us later in the book of 1 Maccabees as well as over in 2 Maccabees. But we've already looked at the first invasion of Egypt and how he returned, Epiphanes returned through Israel. Just to remind yourself of that in 1 Maccabees 1, look back up in verses 20 through 28. On his return from the conquest of Egypt in the year 143, well, that's 170. 143 equals 170, which means over in verse 54 that 145 equals 168 then. They're counting ahead. Of course, we're counting backwards. We're trying to get to the time of Christ. They're counting forward from the foundation of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus marched with a strong force against Israel and Jerusalem. In his arrogance, he entered the temple, carried off the golden altar. They could have gotten another one later on, of course. The lampstand with all its equipment, because we don't know that the equipment they have right now is the same equipment that Moses began with over 1,000 years earlier. It was carried away to Babylon, much of it. Some of it was lost. Some of it was returned. But how do we know that that which was returned is that which they have at this period? Probably they don't. Probably it's a copy of something that they've had earlier. And so if it's carried away, they'll simply make a new one. The table for the bread of the presence, mistranslated in King James as the shewbread, it should be the bread of the presence, the sacred cups and bowls, the golden censers, the curtain and crowns. That was in 170, the first time that he returned, corresponding to Daniel 11 and verse 28. He'll return to his own land with great riches, and his heart will be against the holy covenant. He'll do exploits and return to his own land. Then look at verse 29 now. Now this corresponds with what we're studying tonight. 2 years later. That's how we know it's 168. The king sent to the towns of Judea a high revenue official who arrived at Jerusalem with a powerful force. Now, let me say something about that verse before we get into reading this long section, and then we have to go over to 2 Maccabees 5 and read that. 2 Maccabees 5, and I believe it's the first verse, speaks about the day, the actual day in which Epiphanes set his own feet within the confines of Jerusalem. Here it says, 2 years later the king sent to the towns of Judea a high revenue official. However, we know from 2 Maccabees that Epiphanes actually goes there himself. Whether he's still down in Egypt, and after Linus has told him to leave from the Roman Senate, then he first of all sends an envoy up there, and then he's going to come up there later. We don't know whether that happened, or he's already marched through Israel, and he's gone up to Syria, and then he sends down this chief officer, and then he comes down himself. We don't know what the order is, but that's not significant. We know that all of this is happening within a short period of time in 168 BC. But read this with me carefully here, because this depicts some of the persecution that they're going through, according to what we've seen here in these verses. His language was friendly but full of guile. That sounds like Epiphanes, according to the 21st verse, the first verse in Daniel 11 that describes him. For once he had gained the city's confidence, he suddenly attacked it. He dealt it a heavy blow and killed many Israelites, plundering the city and setting it ablaze. He pulled down houses and walls on every side. Women and children were made prisoners and the cattle seized. The city of David was turned into a citadel. You see, the city of David is not the same as Jerusalem. I trust you know that those are two different things. Jerusalem began in its initial stage and phase with what was known as the city of David. But the city of David is the hill that today and in this time existed a little bit south of the city. Still referred to as the city of David, but it's not Jerusalem though. Anyway, maybe you didn't know that. It's quiet out there. But non-technically they're supposed to be the same, but really they're not. The hill just wasn't big enough. It wasn't big enough. That was a long time ago. How could the whole city of Jerusalem by Christ's time really fit into that little confine? Where you've got a gorge and a valley on the east, a gorge and a valley on the west, and a gorge and a valley on the south. And it continually goes uphill until it reaches right up into what we know today as Jerusalem. So the city of David, the southern part, in other words, you could say the southern part of Jerusalem, was turned into a citadel and enclosed by a high, stout wall with strong towers, garrisoned by impious foreigners and renegades. Foreigners would be Syrians. Renegades would be some of these apostate Israelites. The citadel, this is going to be mentioned several times. Remember over in the book of Acts, it speaks of the castle of Antonia. That was a Roman fortress there. It was a fortress that the Romans used to garrison a cohort of soldiers. Having made themselves secure, they accumulated arms and provisions and deposited there the massed plunder of Jerusalem. There they lay in ambush, a lurking threat to the temple and a perpetual menace to Israel. They shed the blood of the innocent round the temple. They defiled the holy place. The citizens of Jerusalem fled for fear of them. She became an abode of aliens, an alien herself to her offspring. Verse 41, the king then issued this decree that we've discussed, how everyone's going to have to give up their religion. Burnt offerings and sacrifice, libations in the temple are forbidden. Sabbaths and feast days were to be profaned. The temple and its ministers to be defiled. Altars, idols, and sacred precincts were to be established, false ones that is. Swine and other unclean beasts to be offered in sacrifice. They must leave their sons uncircumcised. They must make themselves in every way abominable, unclean, and profane, and so forget the law and change all their statutes, and the penalty for disobedience was death. We read verses 51, 52, 54. Pagan altars were built throughout the towns of Judea. Incense was offered at the doors of the houses and in the streets. All scrolls of the law which were found were torn up and burnt. Anyone discovered in the possession of a book of the covenant or conforming to the law was put to death by the king's sentence. Thus, month after month, this wasn't just something passing. For 3 years, these wicked men used their power against the Israelites whom they found in their towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the pagan altar, which was on top of the altar of the Lord. In accordance with the royal decree, they put to death women who had their children circumcised, their babies, their families, and those who had circumcised them, they hanged by the neck. That's what's going on in Israel at this time. That's why Daniel was so important as far as the people during this period were concerned. The only hope they had is reading Daniel to see that there was a possibility of deliverance here. If you'd be a part of those people who knew their God and would be strong and do exploits, then maybe you wouldn't succumb to all of this evil. And then 2 Maccabees chapter 5, verses 1 through 26. 2 Maccabees chapter 5, verses 1 through 26. About this time, Antiochus undertook his second invasion of Egypt. Apparitions were seen in the sky all over Jerusalem for nearly 40 days. Well, remember, 1 Maccabees is a little more reliable, historically speaking. 2 Maccabees kind of spruces things up for religiously minded people. Galloping horsemen in golden armor, companies of spearmen standing to arms, swords unsheathed, cavalry divisions in battle order, charges and countercharges were made on each side, shields were shaken, spears massed, javelins hurled, breastplates and golden ornaments of every kind shone brightly. All men prayed that this apparition might portend good. All this was seen up in the clouds, you know. Well, that probably didn't happen. The angel and Daniel certainly never said anything about this. They said some people of the Lord would be able to resist the Syrians, but not apparitions in the sky. Now, here's something else that takes place. All of this is not in exact chronological order here, but, well, we'll read it and you'll see what I'm talking about. Upon a false report of Antiochus' death. Now what happens is a report comes back to Israel that Antiochus died in battle against the Egyptians here in his second invasion of the country. And so here's what happens. Jason has been disposed of by Menelaus, and Menelaus is the high priest at this time. Collected no less, and where has Jason been living? Over in the Ammonite territory for a while. Jason collected no less than 1,000 men and made a surprise attack on Jerusalem. And it appears evidently that this surprise attack of Jason on the city that just brought the whole city into confusion before Antiochus really begins his persecution is what started Antiochus to bring his persecution. Whenever he returns grieved there in verses 30 and 31 and finally attacks the city, it seems like although he probably would have done that anyway, the attack of Jason upon the city didn't help matters at all. The defenders on the wall were driven back and the city was finally taken by Jason. Menelaus took refuge in the citadel and Jason continued to massacre his fellow citizens. He's a Jew, without pity. He little knew that success against one's own kindred is the greatest of failures. Now, that's a wise statement there. That's the greatest of failures when you have to murder your own kin. And he imagined that the trophies he raised marked the defeat of enemies, not of fellow countrymen. He did not, however, gain control of the government. He gained only dishonor as a result of his plot and returned again as a fugitive to Ammonite territory. His career came to a miserable end. Verse 9, in the end, the man who had banished so many from their native land himself died in exile after setting sail for Sparta. Verse 11, and when the news of this reached the king, it became clear to him that Judea was in a state of rebellion. So he set out from Egypt in a savage mood and took Jerusalem by storm and ordered his troops to cut down without mercy everyone they met and to slaughter those who took refuge in the houses. Young and old were murdered, women and children massacred, girls and infants butchered. At the end of 3 days, their losses had amounted to 80,000. 40,000 killed in action and 40,000 sold into slavery. 80,000, almost 100,000 people in 3 days time period. It takes X number of seconds to put your sword through someone's belly and pull it back out and go find someone else. And to slaughter 80 or 40,000 and 40,000 into captivity in 3 days. Not satisfied with this, the king had the audacity to enter the holiest temple on earth, guided by Menelaus, who had turned traitor both to his religion and his country. He laid impious hands on the sacred vessels. His desecrating hands swept together the votive offerings which other kings had set up to enhance the splendor and fame of the shrine. The pride of Antiochus passed all bounds. He did not understand that the sins of the people of Jerusalem were what caused the Lord to turn his anger upon them. Verse 21, Antiochus then carried off 1,800 talents from the temple and hastened back to Antioch. In his arrogance, he was rash enough to think that he could make ships sail on dry land and men walk over the sea. He left commissioners behind to oppress the Hebrews, and so forth. Verse 24 towards the end, ordered him to kill all the adult males and to sell the women and boys into slavery. When Apollonius arrived at Jerusalem, he posed as a man of peace. That sounds like Epiphanes. He waited until the holy Sabbath day. Why? Because Jews don't work on the Sabbath day. And if you don't work, you don't fight. Fighting's work. And finding the Jews abstaining from work, he ordered a review of his troops. All who came out to see the parade, he put to the sword. Then charging into the city with his soldiers, he killed a great number of people. And then skipping that 27th verse, that really doesn't fit here. We need to take also the first 2 verses of chapter 6. 2 Maccabees 6, verses 1 to 2. Shortly afterwards, King Antiochus sent an elderly Athenian, probably a philosopher here, to force the Jews to abandon their ancestral customs, no longer regulate their lives according to the laws of God. He was also commissioned to pollute the temple at Jerusalem and dedicate it to Olympian Zeus, and to dedicate the sanctuary on Mount Gerizim to Zeus, god of hospitality, following the practice of the local inhabitants. That pretty much sums up what we're talking about here in these verses in Daniel 11, verses 29 through 31. But we do want to take just a few moments out to look at this abomination of desolation. It was one of 2 things. It was either an idolatrous altar, or perhaps closer to the truth, this is more of my opinion, it was some type of pagan idol that was set up on the existing altar, already found in the Lord's temple. And there appears to be support for this. Let's take 1 Maccabees 1:54 and 1:59. Because if this abomination of desolation has any reference to something future from our point in time today, then in order to understand what it does have reference to, we'll have to understand what it initially signified back here in the days of the Maccabees. 1 Maccabees 1:54. I said either it's an idolatrous altar. We see from 1 Maccabees 1:47 that pagan altars were set up. I know this is kind of detailed, but I've done a lot of study on this. You have to really get every verse down in the books of Maccabees, because it's not all directly in chronological order there. And you have to apply that and parallel it to Daniel 11 anyway. But pagan altars were set up, 1 Maccabees 1:47. So it could have been a pagan altar, but closer to the truth appears to be the pagan idol that was set up on the existing altar. Look at 1 Maccabees 1:54. On the 15th day of the month Kislev in the year 168 BC, the abomination of desolation was set up on the altar. On the altar. Doesn't call it a pagan altar here. As a matter of fact, pagan altar doesn't come to the next sentence. Pagan altars were built throughout the towns of Judea. It's almost like there's a contrast between the Lord's true altar that still existed in the temple at this time and pagan altars. And that, more or less, can be proven in verse 59. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the pagan altar, probably, some, like a platform that was part of the idol, which was on top of the altar of the Lord. It was on top of the altar of the Lord. That altar hasn't been taken out of there. But evidently some platform, like the base of the idol itself, would be considered the pagan altar here that's set up on the altar of the Lord. You can't have 2 altars together where sacrifice is going to be or incense is going to be offered or something. You only have one altar. If one's called the pagan altar, it must be the base of something that's set up on top of the altar of the Lord. That appears to be a better understanding of what took place. Now we know that, and it has it separated from verse 54 to verse 59 by a 10-day period. That's from around December the 1st, 168, to around December the 16th, 168. That Christian reckoning would correspond, that I just gave you, would correspond to the 15th day of Kislev in 145 and the 25th day of Kislev in 145. So what I'm saying is the abomination of desolation, we're told, was set up here in the very beginning of December, the month of December, the abomination of desolation. And then sacrifice is offered on the altar of the Lord, then down in verse 59. And then you have to take this with the references in Daniel to see that we're talking about something. Oh, and before that, we've got that reference still over in 2 Maccabees 6 and verse 2. Speaks of an image of Zeus being set up in the temple. And many people have assumed, and perhaps correctly so, that the image of Zeus was the abomination of desolation. The image of Zeus. I mean, here is the holy altar of the Lord of all the earth. And the physical, sculptured in stone or whatever, image of a god that doesn't exist called Zeus, or called Jupiter, depending on whether you're talking about the Romans or the Greeks. Zeus, an image of him, is set up here on the altar of the Lord, or set up in the proximity of the altar of the Lord, probably on some pedestal or some base on top of the altar. That is the abomination of desolations. That is an abomination. It makes desolate the holy place of the Lord. It abominates it by making it desolate, by setting up such an image like this. Some have even suggested that perhaps the image of Zeus was after the likeness of Epiphanes, and that would make sense. He would probably want his own picture in there. But it would represent, it would stand for the pagan god Zeus. Now this technical phrase, with a few variations, is seen 4 times in Daniel. Now a lot of people don't know that. They think it's only found one place or maybe 2 places. This technical phrase, it's a very technical phrase, with a few minor variations. It's not always exactly the same in the Hebrew, but the idea obviously is the same. It's found 4 times in Daniel. We're going to look at all 4 of those. Daniel 8, 9, 11, and 12. Daniel 8, 9, 11, and 12. And it appears like 2 of these passages go together. Chapter 8 and chapter 11 refer to the same thing. And then the other 2 are to go together. Chapter 9 and chapter 12 refer to the same thing, but they're separated by many thousands of years of history. Daniel 8 and 11, the references to the abomination that maketh desolate, or the desolation of abominations, or abomination of desolations, however you want to translate it. Daniel 8 and 11 go together, and 9 and 12 go together. Okay, Daniel 8, verses 13 and 14. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice? There's that daily sacrifice. We already saw daily sacrifice over there in Daniel 11, when it's going to stop. And the transgression of desolation. Now there's the phrase again, but you can see there's a variation in it. Instead of abomination of desolation, it's transgression of desolation. To give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot. And he said unto me, for 2,300 days, a little over 6 years, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. We discussed this passage last time. You remember the 2 different views we looked at? One would actually make this refer not to Jason or Menelaus being deposed or something, but to this period from 168 December to 165 December. And it's speaking of the abomination of desolations. Then you've already got your passage in chapter 11. And then another group would be chapter 9. and verse 27. Chapter 9 and verse 27. Now we know, well, we think that we know. I say we think that we know the church. We think that we know the church as a whole, what this is talking about. But this is some very, very interesting prophecy. I mean, probably, well, you hate to say more books have been written about this passage than some other, but I mean a lot of books have been written about the last half here of Daniel 9. Let's say more about Daniel 9 than Daniel 10, that's for sure. Especially verses 24 through 27, so-called 70 weeks of Daniel. Sure, you've heard that before. Yeah. Bible prophecy, Daniel 70 weeks. What in the world does that really mean? Well, it's a lot of difficult Hebrew here to translate. But we're not concerned about that, or we'd be here forever. Let's get down to verse 27. He shall confirm the covenant with many for a week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice, we're back to daily sacrifice, and the oblation to cease. For the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. Same phrase, but you see variations here. For the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Even in the English it's difficult to understand. And then if you look over in Daniel 12 and verse 11. 12 and verse 11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away. That's why, well, I won't say that yet, I'll say it in a moment. The abomination that maketh desolate, set up, there shall be 1,290 days. That's just a little bit over 3.5 years, about a month over 3.5 years. 1,290 days. Okay, those are the only 4 places where it's found in the Old Testament. Notice all of them are in Daniel. 8, 9, 11, and 12. 8 and 11 appear to go together, 9 and 12. Then if you look over in the Gospels, we do find it there. It's found, let's look at Mark 13 first of all. Mark 13 and verse 14. Mark 13, 14. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet. So he's really tracing it back to Daniel. Standing where it ought not. Now Mark doesn't tell us in his account where it ought not to stand. He just said it's standing where it ought not. But where's the ought not place? Well, you have to go back to Matthew to find out where it ought not to be, and it is. Matthew 24 and verse 15. And when ye shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Holy place must be the ought not place of Mark then. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Probably that means whosoever is reading the book of Daniel, not Matthew, because Jesus was speaking this to his disciples on the Mount of Olives and no one was reading it, they were listening to it. Whoso readeth the book of Daniel, let him understand. And those are the only other places where it's found in the Bible. So I think that tallies up 6 total. 4 in Daniel, 1 in Mark, 1 in Matthew. Now, of course, the question of questions is, how do these New Testament references relate to those in the Old Testament? Do we have as many as 3 fulfillments of Abomination of Desolations? Would be one question we could ask. Another question we could ask would be, are any of the 3, or if you have some other number besides 3, it'd probably have to be 2, are any of these, in any sense of the word, to be connected to the time just prior to the second advent of Christ? Now that is a difficult set of questions. I mean, what does he say here? When therefore ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Spoken of by Daniel where? In Daniel 8, or 9, or 11, or 12. He doesn't say where. Our interpretation of the 11th chapter of Daniel reference to AD is definitely correct. That was fulfilled. That's past tense as far as we're concerned. That's over with. The abomination of desolation is over with as far as Daniel 11 is concerned. Since Daniel 8 is talking about the exact same context as chapter 11, Daniel 8 AD We'll say that to shorten the Abomination of Desolations. Daniel 8 AD is all over with. Daniel 9 and Daniel 12 didn't happen then. When did they happen, or have they happened yet? Well, that really would be the problem then. Did that not happen in AD 70, whenever the Romans came in under Titus, sacked the city, destroyed the temple, and according to some sources, set up some type of pagan altar or idol upon an altar in the Lord's holy temple? Therefore, that would be the Abomination of Desolations, one that took place under Epiphanes, one that took place in the time right after Christ died and rose and ascended to heaven in AD 70. What would make that very inviting is look at the connection here. Matthew 24:15. When you shall see that. When you shall see that. Okay, let's skip the verse down to verse 16. When you shall see the AD, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. By the time you go from verse 15 to verse 21, it almost looks like you're talking about two different periods in history. This says in verse 21 that somehow connected with this, with these verses we've just read preceding that, there's going to be a time of persecution that has never existed for Israel, including that under Antiochus Epiphanes, no, nor ever shall be. Now, if that happened in AD 70, that's saying that persecution is going to be worse, was worse, than what they'll experience during the tribulation then. That doesn't hardly seem possible. But, we know that verses 16 through 20 were fulfilled in AD 70. Was a prophecy. Some of the Christians, some of the Jews didn't take this to heart because they didn't believe Jesus as the Messiah. But the Christians, whether they were Gentile or Jewish Christians, they took Jesus' words literally here. When they saw the abomination of desolation under Titus, they took off out of the city and fled. So that's one way you can interpret it. The second way you can interpret it would be that it applies to the time just prior to the second advent, and it's comparable to what we have in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4. Who opposeth, this is Antichrist here, who opposeth the man of sin, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And by him spreading himself out in the temple, he desolates, abominates the holy place of the Lord, which would then be a latter-day reference to the fulfillment not only of Mark chapter 13 and verse 14 and Matthew 24 and verse 15, but Daniel 9 and Daniel chapter 12 as well.